Murdoch was allowed to get too powerful in Australia.
Now, that's the cancer on democracy in our country, Australia. But
the misinformation that reaches the Fox News audience is a danger to public health.
It's actually the safest time to fly.
Thank you to my very good friend, Rupert Murdoch.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. This week, we examine Rupert Murdoch, one of the world's biggest media empires, and its coverage of COVID-19. We're focusing on the two countries where Murdoch's companies, News Corp and Fox Corporation, are most heavily invested and at their most influential, Australia and the United States. On the American side, Fox News' reporting on the coronavirus has been politically partisan, inaccurate to the point of being a legitimate danger to the health of its viewers. Sky News Australia, as well as newspapers like The Australian, use a similar formula as Fox, whether it's this pandemic or coverage of climate change. A parade of right-wing commentators reflecting the channel's politics and dismissing the science, if that's what it takes. Australia is also where two former prime ministers are now saying it's time to bring Murdoch media outlets there under control. Later in this program, I'll speak with one of them, Malcolm Turnbull. But first, The Listening Post's Flo Phillips on the Murdoch factor in COVID-19 coverage, stateside and down under.
Political editor at the Daily Telegraph in Australia. She joins us live from Sydney.
Just another night on Fox News and one of America's highest-rated political talk shows, Tucker Carlson Tonight. Except sharp-eyed viewers would have seen in this segment how Rupert Murdoch's news outlets, even those located in different parts of the world, can work hand in hand to further a common agenda.
This is a serious case of cover-up by China.
Carlson's guest, beaming in from Sydney, is Shari Markson, political editor of the Murdoch-owned Daily Telegraph. She also hosts a programme on his news channel, Sky News Australia. On May 2nd, Markson broke an exclusive story based on a leaked intelligence dossier from what she called concerned Western governments. The dossier suggested the coronavirus may have been created in a lab in the Chinese city of Wuhan, where the very first cases of COVID-19 were detected. The story's first stop, the Daily Telegraph. Its second stop, Sky News Australia.
The paper prepared by concerned Western governments that mounts the case against China's deliberate cover-up of the coronavirus.
Third stop, the US and Fox News.
Because it's a multinational effort, I think it would be hard to dismiss it as a political document.
Cross-pollination between media outlets in the same organization is common if there's merit to the story. But the dossier they called a bombshell turned out to be a dud. Fact-checkers concluded it amounted to nothing more than the results of a glorified Google search.
But your piece is a blow against lying, and so I'm so grateful that you wrote it and that your paper ran it. Sure,
as for those concerned Western governments, from all indications, the story was leaked to the Daily Telegraph by the US State Department.
It's an amazing piece of journalism that you turned out, and I'm ashamed that no one in America beat you to it.
Murdoch's press has done that over the years on occasion, where they will take information in the Australian Murdoch press and then recycled it back into the American news mainstream, allowing them not to hang the hat of an American news outlet on it.
Elements of the Murdoch press in Australia have really focused in on the narrative that really began out of the US, that the virus has escaped from a Wuhan lab. The most vociferous has been the commentators on Sky News.
The evil deceptions of the Chinese communist regime.
Running the same sort of line as we've seen from Pompeo and Trump himself, that, China has a lot of questions to answer. And I think there has been some attempt by the US to sway Australia firmly into the critics of China. And of course, News Corporation publications play an important part in that.
The US and Australia are by far and away the two biggest branches of Rupert Murdoch's media empire. In the land of his birth, Murdoch and his media conglomerate News Corporation are in sight of monopoly. He owns the country's only national paper, The Australian, Sydney's Daily Telegraph, dozens of regional outlets, and Sky News Australia. Murdoch's outsized influence makes him a de facto kingmaker in Australian politics. News Corp is notorious for using its outlets to lobby hard for or against favoured politicians or policies. In the US, Murdoch's adopted home, Fox News is the most visible and most profitable of his American holdings. He and his eldest son, Lachlan Murdoch, the heir apparent, also control the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. And there's no one-size-fits-all Murdoch news template.
In the US, Murdoch follows kind of a high-low formula that you see emulated in the UK and Australia. The high is represented in some ways by the Wall Street Journal, which has done very straight-ahead reporting, intensive reporting about all the elements involving this crisis. And then you have Fox News, as well as the New York Post. And they've taken a more alarmist, a more conflict-generating kind of approach to covering this.
Murdoch's news outlets are used to criticism. They have thick corporate skins. But the backlash they've been getting for their coronavirus coverage is on another level.
April 3rd, 2020. An open letter to Fox Corporation Chairman Rupert Murdoch and Fox Corporation CEO Lachlan Murdoch.
Todd Gitlin is a journalism professor at Columbia University in New York. In April, alarmed by what Fox was saying about the virus, Gitlin wrote a letter to the Murdochs, and he was not alone. 186 of his media colleagues signed on too.
The misinformation that reaches the Fox News audience is a danger to public health. Inexcusably, Fox News has violated elementary canons of journalism. In so doing, it has contributed to the spread of a grave pandemic. Urgently, therefore, in the name of both good journalism and public health, we call upon you to help protect the lives of all Americans, including your elderly viewers, by ensuring that the information you deliver is based on scientific facts. I've been holding a number of conversations with friends and colleagues about the toxic role played by Fox News in our general political landscape, but in particular about the coronavirus.
They're scaring the living hell out of people, and I see it again as like, oh, let's bludgeon Trump with this new hoax.
Hannity channeled a message that Trump delivered frequently at a time when the coronavirus could have been stopped much earlier than it was, to the effect that the pandemic was a democratic hoax, that the miracles would take place and the disease would vanish.
I'm not afraid of the coronavirus, and no one else should be that afraid either.
All kinds of garbage, all kinds of absolute quackery.
We asked Fox News for comment on the chorus of criticism around its coverage. They referred us to multiple on-air segments and news reports illustrating that both primetime and news programming had emphasized the severity of the then-emerging outbreak since mid-January, including breaking the news that positive cases would escalate to hundreds of thousands across the country. Their response wasn't a surprise. The high-low formula is at play within Fox News, too. While many segments do provide straight reporting, it's the opinion mongers that like to play fast and loose with the facts and use sensationalism to go viral. For instance, that clip Fox News referred us to, it has 13,000 views on Facebook. I couldn't even find it on YouTube. The previous day, however, Sean Hannity had an exclusive interview with President Trump. Trump downplayed the severity of the virus, calling it a corona flu, with zero pushback from Sean Hannity. That interview? Almost 400,000 views on Facebook and 1.7 million on YouTube. The criticism over Fox News' COVID coverage does continue to mount, but it seems the network has little to worry about.
It's my distinct honor to introduce the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, my friend Donald J. Trump.
The President is on message.
And thank you to my very good friend, Rupert Murdoch. There's only one Rupert that we know.
In Australia, it's a different story. Leading the calls to bring Murdoch and News Corp under control are two former Prime Ministers, Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd. While in office, both tried to appease Murdoch, but since being ousted, which they partly blame on negative coverage in the Murdoch press, they've gone public on the perils of News Corp's influence. Kevin Rudd has written an op-ed during the pandemic on the company's pro-Trump, anti-China agenda. And last year, he described the Murdoch media as a cancerous growth on Australia's democracy. And former News Corp reporters are also speaking out. Anthony Clan spent 15 years on the inside of The Australian. He quit last year, citing serious misgivings over the paper's editorial direction and its overtly political agenda.
News Corporation's always held onto a narrative in being contrarian, which is something that attracted me in the first place to the organisation. But when that's used as a mask for pushing vested interests, then it's an entirely different story. I've never seen anything like this in the last 2 years, nothing at all. Basically, all the worst excesses that had been around for years were magnified and undiluted. Our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, is known a little bit for hyperbole, but if you have a major media corporation that's suppressing information from the public so that the public can't make informed decisions, then he's right. It has become a cancer on democracy.
The problem for Australia, though, is that we just have so few voices, that various takeovers have been allowed to happen in what's a relatively small market, and now we're reaping what we've sown. We do have some countervailing forces, like we have a very well-funded public broadcaster, but basically News Corporation, because of its reach to so many cities, the national newspaper, the main 24-hour news channel, it has extraordinary clout in Australian politics.
In the US, Fox News has also seen the departure of journalists who say the network has gone too far. Carl Cameron was one of Fox News's first hires. He joined when the channel launched in 1996.
Bush wraps up his campaign day in Delaware, then flies to South Carolina.
His beat was politics. He had an inside view of a channel lurching further and further to the right.
Let's begin with Chief Political Correspondent Carl Cameron, live at Trump headquarters.
In 2017, after the election of Donald Trump, Cameron quit.
There still is a difference between the journalists and the opinion hosts at Fox. What's changed is the total disparity. There are way more opinion makers than there are news reporters. Fox supports the president through its opinion host.
We watch President Donald Trump daily as he works to take this nation from a place of frightening vulnerability to a place of physical, economic, and spiritual strength.
After 9/11 and ultimately the Iraq War, that's when things began to get much more nationalistic on Fox, much more red, white, and blue, and ultimately where things began to kind of go off the rails with news versus opinion.
Look, there are very good journalists who work at Fox and very good people who work there. That is not the point of Fox. The point of Fox is not to do good journalism. The point of Fox is to put on a lively and entertaining programming that either appeals to people's pleasure palate or creates enough anxiety in them to keep them watching.
And like with the Mueller investigation, like with the Ukraine case,
Rupert Murdoch's media outlets have long been at ideological odds with liberal politicians and journalists who lean to the left. More telling than that, however, is the adversarial relationship that they now have with science. Before turning their focus onto COVID-19, Murdoch's commentators were aggressively fighting the prevailing narrative, the science, on climate change.
The best analogy that we have for Fox's coverage, particularly its early coverage of the coronavirus pandemic, is in some ways climate change, where you would have Fox privilege essentially unproven, unsubstantiated, and marginal assertions and elevated them to the equal of the consensus of the vast majority of the scientific community.
climate trends that we're experiencing are natural.
Which isn't to say there aren't scientific disputes, and isn't to say also that our knowledge doesn't evolve and shift and change. It's almost to portray scientific and medical knowledge as though it's the same as political debate.
The News Corporation publications have been the last bastion of climate denialism in Australia. And they would say we're giving equal time to both sides, but even as the science has advanced to the point where it's really hard to find a scientist who says climate change doesn't exist, they've continued with a lot of coverage that casts doubt on climate change.
There is such a thing as just plain weather.
When I started at the organisation, I believed it was 90% ideology at least. But now I've come to the opinion it's 10% ideology, the rest of it's money and vested interest. It's incredibly in the pockets of the lobbyists, of the minerals, of the mining, the gas, and of the big banks. The News Corporation's response to climate change and coronavirus, one of the biggest threats of our generation, was extraordinarily similar. It was sort of denial, it's not happening, talking it down, excuses. I was just amazed.
There's little debate to be had over what the Skies and Fox Newses of the world are doing. The Murdochs, Rupert and Lachlan, are shrewd businessmen, and they know that opinions, even misinformed, misguided ones, are easier to sell than facts.
When I give lectures to kids in college who are talking about going to journalism school, I say, what do you think my product is? And they say, oh, the truth, oh, the news, what's relevant, what's really important, blah, 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 blah. And as far as my bosses were concerned, my product was your eyeballs on a Geico commercial. And one of the things that people don't understand is that everything that they're watching right now, people are making money off of. Everything that comes out of my mouth is going to lead somebody to watch a TV ad, watch something on or an ad on their handheld, or this is commerce. That's what it's about.
The extent to which the Murdochs actually believe the sometimes dubious and occasionally dangerous content their platforms put out is something the family keeps to itself. The business model, no mystery. Whether the news channels are beaming out of Sydney or New York, opinions count more than facts. Profits trump the truth, even during a pandemic.
Analyzing the journalism produced by Murdoch media outlets is straightforward. Understanding what motivates the man at the top is more complicated. Rupert Murdoch seldom speaks to the press. We know that he holds conservative views, demands, and gets access to political leaders. However, ideology does not always explain his actions or his agenda. One man who knows Murdoch better than most is a former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. Turnbull has dealt with Murdoch over the decades, first as a journalist covering Murdoch's rise in the US, then as a politician, when, according to Turnbull, Rupert Murdoch led an insurgency in the press to oust him from the Prime Minister's office. If Murdoch turned on Turnbull, Turnbull has since returned the favor. It's all documented in his new memoir, A Bigger Picture. Malcolm Turnbull joins me now to discuss all of that and more. Mr. Turnbull, thanks for joining us here at the Listening Post today.
Yeah, great to be with you, Richard.
You haven't always been a critic of Rupert Murdoch, have you? In fact, you write about interviewing Murdoch back in the 1970s when you were a journalist based in New York City, and you wrote that you couldn't help but admire Murdoch. Did you get that story wrong back in the day?
I don't think so. He was, he was young, he was progressive, politically, liberal with a small L in those days, and he was taking on the established newspaper media world right around the globe. There was a lot to admire there. Over the years, Murdoch's media have reflected a very different set of political priorities. His media outlets are the biggest amplifiers in the English-speaking world, anyway, of climate change denial. Of course, he latched on to Brexit and was a great supporter of Brexit, and of course, an enormous supporter and enabler of Donald Trump.
You also wrote that the one thing the Murdochs prize above all else is power. So, is the Murdoch agenda with Trump, Brexit, climate change, now the coronavirus, more about power than it is about ideology?
Well, power is an aphrodisiac, and people, particularly people in the media, pursue it for its own sake. They want to have politicians who will defer to them, obey them, and that's what turns them on. Sometimes there is a political or ideological purpose attached to it, but they've all found power and influence an attractive thing, an alluring thing in and of itself. But influence to what end? I mean, this is the bizarre thing. All of that power, all of that enormous megaphone. But really, is this the Murdoch legacy? Brexit, climate change denial, and Donald Trump. For those three great political agendas to be seen as triumphs? I wouldn't have thought so. I don't think history will judge them to be so in any event.
Speaking of political agendas, part of the reason that Murdoch's media outlets went after you is that you, as Prime Minister, you were advocating a coordinated approach to deal with climate change. Why is it that Murdoch feels so strongly about this issue in particular?
The answer to that is that there has been this toxic alliance between right-wing populist politics, right-wing populist media, which is its biggest enabler and amplifier, and then, of course, you've got the vested interests of the fossil fuel lobby. Throughout my time as Prime Minister, and indeed before that, there was strong opposition to my leadership from News Corp. Murdoch himself admitted to me, in a conversation in my last week as Prime Minister, he admitted that his most senior editorial executive in Australia, Paul Whitaker, was part of the campaign to remove me. It ebbed and flowed, but in particularly with the commentators, particularly with their television network, it was relentless.
You're not the only former Prime Minister of Australia speaking out against Rupert Murdoch these days. Your predecessor, Kevin Rudd, who's from the other side of the political aisle, has been equally vocal recently. Can you tell me, why is this happening? And why is it happening now?
The Murdoch press runs now as a political operation. It's effectively a political party. It is ruthlessly partisan. It builds up and supports its friends. It doesn't hold them to account at all, and it is relentless in its attacks on their political rivals or opponents. A few decades ago, you could say that this newspaper lent that way, that newspaper lent that way, but they all tried, to a greater or lesser extent, to do an effective job of news reporting. That's been thrown out of the window. These are now vehicles for opinion and political propaganda, and what Rudd says about them is essentially the same observation that any fair-minded, objective observer of the Australian media scene would say as well.
You're speaking out against Rupert Murdoch now, but that didn't happen while you were in office, certainly not with these kinds of terms. I guess my question, Mr. Turnbull, is, will we ever see a sitting Australian Prime Minister offering this type of criticism of Rupert Murdoch, or is there just too much fear of the consequences?
I think that taking on the Murdoch media would be, for a Prime Minister or a Premier, would be very, very challenging. There's an old saying that you shouldn't pick fights with people who buy ink by the barrel. In politics, you've got to deal with all of these interests, and picking a fight with the largest media company in the country is probably not going to be very smart.
Rupert Murdoch was clearly allowed to grow too powerful, and his media machine continues to have a huge influence on Australian politics. Will anyone ever be able to bring this media empire under control, or is it too late for that to happen?
Rupert Murdoch is entitled to be as biased and as partisan as he likes. I mean, it's a free country. But one thing that you're increasingly seeing is advertisers just walking away from broadcasters and newspapers that are too extreme. There is a shock jock in Sydney, Alan Jones, who is still being broadcast on Murdoch's pay TV channel, Sky News, but he had a big radio audience on a radio network belonging to another proprietor, and the one by one advertisers started walking away because of pressure from the public, who were offended by the relentless climate change denialism, but particularly misogyny.
But something could have been done by previous governments to limit concentration, and that hasn't happened. Kevin Rudd is now talking about a royal commission, an investigative exercise led by government to assess the impact of the Murdoch media empire in Australia. Is that the direction this should go in?
Look, I'm not persuaded that a royal commission into the press would be particularly useful or particularly effective. At the end of the day, media outlets are entitled to be biased if they choose. Now, I just make this point, however, about concentration. The reason Murdoch has 70+% of Australian metropolitan newspaper sales is because in 1987 a Labor government allowed Murdoch to buy the Herald and Weekly Times Group. And that was a very controversial takeover that should not have been allowed. And it was that's what created that extraordinary concentration.
And Australians have been living with the consequences ever since. We'll have to leave it there. Malcolm Turnbull, thanks for joining us today. Rupert Murdoch is not a young man. He can't go on forever. His eldest son, Lachlan, is waiting in the wings with political views that are described as even more conservative and contrarian than his father's. One final telling note. Back in March, when Fox News and Sky Australia were still playing down the dangers of COVID-19, Murdoch cancelled his 89th birthday party. He was afraid he would catch the virus. Rupert Murdoch is comfortable with his journalists questioning the science when it makes sense for his business, not when it comes to his own health. He doesn't practice what his news channels preach, he just profits from it. If only his viewers and his readers were as well informed. You've been watching a special edition of our program on the Murdoch media empire. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.